Welcome to the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. I'm your host, Kate Powell. In a world where humans who feel vibrant, whole, and fully alive seem to be increasingly rare, where burnout and brokenness seem to be increasingly the norm, both in individuals and our larger ecosystems, it seems worth exploring how did we get here? And more importantly, what perspectives or what cultural practices or what spiritual, ancestral, or animist wisdom processes might help us stay true to the spark and rhythm of our aliveness on this wild, heartbreaking, but ultimately rare and precious life. Thank you for being here. May these conversations help us to stay human in the face of dehumanizing forces. May they nourish our wild, tender hearts, and may they plant seeds which flourish into a more regenerative and vibrant future. Hey, Kate with Wild Sacred Journey here. So in the wake of my last podcast episode, the one about, I think, pitfalls that I think the wellness world can fall into if we're not doing our shadow work, I had a listener send me an email, and she said she'd kind of listened to an interview with Elizabeth Gilbert talking about purpose anxiety before she'd listened to my episode, and then had kind of been drawing parallels in her own mind between purpose anxiety and burnout and integration, and kind of, just expressing some of her musings and some more questions that then she felt like she was having, and wondering if I had any thoughts. And so I think we're going to have a two-part episode here, because I think to really go deep into what integration is kind of its own thing. But I want to start with purpose anxiety, because I do see this a lot, I think, particularly for those of us who I think are multi-passionate, multi-interested people. So, pause here for a second. So with this purpose anxiety, I think we humans have this deep intrinsic desire to be of contribution in some way, of service, and to find some kind of meaning in life, some sort of sense that there's a purpose for us being here, and maybe even a purpose for the challenges and the suffering and everything that we go through. And so, there are some people who are naturally more single track, right? And those people find something that they're just so passionate about from a young age, and they go all in on it, and they achieve some level of mastery, and they've found, quote unquote, found their purpose, right? But most of the rest of us are significantly more like ecosystems in our own sense, right? We have immense amounts of biodiversity even within our bodies, within our interests, within our passions. And so, I see a lot for myself, and then I see a lot with my clients, that for those of us who are multi-passionate and who also have this deep desire for something meaningful, for some sort of life that is beautiful and meaningful, for some sort of sense of bigger picture, just some bigger picture sense, I guess, of the universe, we can end up with a lot of burnout, partly because I think we're sort of misunderstanding this idea of purpose. I'm also reading Cal, I'm blanking on his last name right now, but the book Slow Productivity, and he's even talking about how we actually have sort of come to misunderstand what the word, or we lack an actual firm definition around what productivity is. So how do we know we're being productive if we don't even have this definition? Instead, it's sort of this amorphous, intangible measuring stick that we're using to kind of just beat ourselves up, right? With no sense of outcome, no sense of completion. I think in some ways purpose can kind of be the same thing. And certainly it's been co-opted by capitalism. It's been co-opted by empire, and not necessarily consciously, but, our brains are wired after years of living in those types of systems. Our brains are wired to kind of consider things through the lenses of those systems. So part of the reason we see purpose and we see people who are inherently a little bit more linear, a little bit more single track, and we see them quote unquote discover their purpose in a young age, which is really just following their pleasure, following their interest, right? We see them do that at a young age and then achieve this mastery, and then we beat ourselves up when we haven't done the same thing. And we spend all this time and energy and money seeking, what's that thing, what's that thing, what's that thing for me, right? And in reality, again, for most of us, that purpose may not be so linear. Again, empire wants us to kind of all be more or less the same because it's easier to control us. We see that in agriculture, agriculture moving towards monocropping and monoagriculture because it's quote unquote easier, right? Doesn't make it more resilient, certainly doesn't make it more aligned with aliveness. But in this sort of capitalist empire, colonialist, exploitative, and extractive measure of productivity or of efficiency, then so these spaces where things are resources rather than relationships, right? Then there's little consideration for the long term. It's all about kind of the immediate thing. So we kind of fall into the trap of feeling this sense of urgency, having our purpose become entangled with our productivity, this sense of our doingness, and then plus it can get entangled with our fear of death, right? The sense that time's running out, we need to leave some kind of legacy, right? And suddenly we've ended up in this incredibly sort of dysregulated, burnt out state where we're grasping, right? And yet it's like, when we think we're hungry and we keep eating, but it's actually that we're thirsty and we're misinterpreting the signals our body is sending, right? So it's kind of like the same thing. We're thirsty for something, but we keep feeding ourselves instead of actually quenching our thirst. We're sort of misapplying something, misapplying the quote unquote solution, because we're misidentifying what the actual problem is. So in many ways, I think what the actual problem is, well, again, at the heart of most of what you'll hear me talk about is the inevitability of burnout, and purpose anxiety is just a form of burnout. The inevitability of that in systems where everything is a resource rather than a relationship, right? So that's at the heart of it. But I think a piece of this is, again, also this thing where we personalize. We live in such an individualistic culture. We live within these cultural myths of individualism, of objective observer, right? Quantum theory, quantum physics has shown that there is no such thing as an objective observer, right? We, the observer, influences what's happening. It's in a state of potentiality until someone looks at it and says, is there a wave here? And then it's like, oh yeah, there is. Oh, but what about, is there a particle here? Oh, nope, now it's a particle, That's a gross oversimplification. But, at its heart, the same even with journalism, right? We're seeing, I suspect part of why we have sort of no sense of discernment when it comes to misinformation right now is that we've fallen into this myth that there is some sort of impartial account of historic events, that there is some sort of impartial news, when in reality everything's being filtered through something. We don't walk on the earth, we belong to the earth. We're not impartial observers for this thing called life. We are life expressing itself in the collective form of humanity, and then in each of us individual forms of humanity, right? In the collective mycelial field, and then in the individual expressions of mushroom, right? So with purpose, we've fallen into this trap of believing that there is some individual purpose. And while I do believe that each of us are a specific, unique flavor of aliveness, of love, of the expression of that, in the way that then kind of like how polytheism, part of that is that God is too big to be encompassed by any one face, right? So you need multiple aspects of God represented, of one concept of the universe represented through these different deities, these different consciousnesses, right? Same with, what if it's the same for humans, right? Like, what if, because of our different experiences, our lineages, our, all of those things, it's like we're each a filter for this divine energy moving through us. So in that sense, yes, there is a certain unique quality to each of us, but it's not something we have to go out and find. It's something we just have to live and express, right? So when we fall into this trap of individualism, part of that then too is that, we think that there's this thing that each of us is supposed to find that's nobody else has ever done before, that's just ours, right? So right there, we've taken relationship out of it. We've created what is actually our genuine uniqueness. We've now turned it into some sort of resource that we're trying to extract some kernel of something and create and then monetize and then give back and somehow change the world with, right? And that's another piece of this myth of individualism, is this sort of myth of savior, which is this idea that somehow in each of us individually has some task to save the world, right? And maybe some people will, maybe you will, maybe I will, I don't know. But once again, if we are outside, in order to be able to save the world, we have to almost be outside of it enough. There's this undertone, at least I hear this in this idea of saving the world, is there's this undertone that the world is over there, and then there's some kind of threat, and I'm somehow outside of each of those things and able to somehow intervene or step between them, rather than I am deeply entwined with both the world and the threat. And there's a relationship, there's a moment where the world and the threat meet each other in me. And the relationship that then unfolds between the two in me is my piece of saving the world. Ooh, I just got teary there. I don't think I've ever articulated in exactly that way before. Oh, I'm gonna give that a minute. Yeah, so what if we're each the meeting ground of all these forces? And so I say sometimes that, it's not that each of us is the entire world, but it's that, in many ways, the entire world exists within us. Like, our small microcosm of the world that is each of us is the part of the world we have the most power within. And I don't say power over, and I say power within. So if empire is constantly trying to evolve towards narrower pyramid, right? And evolution, by contrast, is evolving towards wider, towards more diversity. Then part of why this idea of purpose as being such a linear, specific, individual thing that can then be monetized, weaponized in some kind of way. The reason that it's so easy for that to kind of take over, and it's so easy for us to fall into the trap of believing that, is along the way to that, part of what happens is that any parts of us that are too wild, or too much, or too human, really, are too hard to control, are too hard to quantify or qualify even, are too hard to name, label, compartmentalize. Those parts of us get kind of lopped off and shut away to the side. And we've talked about that some in the shadow work episodes. But this means then that when it comes time for us to search for meaning, we're fragmented within ourselves, we're partial. And if our purpose is in fact to just express love through the unique filter that is each of us, right? To express aliveness through the unique filter that is each of us, if that is in fact our purpose, then we can't do that if we are fragmented, if these parts of us have been sent outside to live somewhere outside of us, have been lopped off, right? So of course, we don't know where to turn to in that moment, right? So this is where, again, I think part of where purpose anxiety comes from is that we're personalizing a cultural poverty. We're personalizing a cultural rupture and issue. And we're assuming that the fact that we can't figure out who, quote unquote, who we are and quote unquote, what we're meant to do is somehow a personal failing. And we fear that, and it dysregulates us further, which keeps us more in this state of fragmentation, which then keeps us grasping after all these different solutions. And conveniently, capitalism has figured out how to monetize all the solutions and market all the solutions and push that pain button and make us think we have to, oh, maybe it's here, maybe it's here, maybe it's here, maybe it's here, right? And we're thirsty, but we don't realize we're thirsty. We think we're hungry instead, and so we're grasping, right? And we're going through all that. And that's another way of interacting with resources rather than relationships. Everything then is something for us to take to try and soothe or nourish or finger in the dam, like stop up the dam, or, whatever it is that we're the right analogy for us in that moment when we're grasping. If we had relationships more in our culture, we would know that we kind of live in this paradox between we are always the expert of ourselves and also we are always our biggest blind spots. We're not, I can't see my own back, not without the help of a mirror or somebody else, not really. Some days when I'm feeling more flexible, I can see a little bit more of it than others, but there's literally parts of our bodies we can't see. And it's the same with our inner worlds. There are parts of them we are always going to be the worst at seeing, partly because we're protecting ourselves maybe from something that scares us, partly because our gifts are always going to be nestled with our wounds. I've talked about this in another episode, right? If someone's like, I have, brown hair. If someone's like, ugh, I hate brown hair. Okay. My brown hair is not that important to me in terms of my sense of who I am. So I might be like, okay, ouch, or like, oh, that's a little weird, but it's not. It's mostly going to roll off. It's not really going to bury whatever sharp word that was, whatever sharp barb was being thrown my way. It's not really going to bury itself. If, however, one of the things that's super, super important to me is being caring. And so if someone says to me, well, that was just the most selfish, horrible, uncaring thing I've ever seen, that would probably hit a lot deeper, honestly. That would have me mind fucking for quite a while. And sometimes that's useful feedback. Maybe there's some truth in that, right? Maybe they're pointing to something I haven't seen. But the point is I would probably carry those words with me for a while. And if I'm not careful, I could make a whole identity out of it, especially if there's somebody I respected. So suddenly now, every time I try to access my caringness, which is actually one of my superpowers, I would also have this wound that would get activated too. Which means then that any of the patterns I put in place to protect myself from the ouchness of the wound would also get activated every time I try to be caring, right? So that's how our shadow wounds, our shadow work gets so important. And part of why having mirroring from other people, working with other professionals can be super important. We are not meant to know what our purpose is by ourselves. because our purpose is actually relational. I'm going to start crying again. I don't know why I'm so cryy today. Our purpose, because it's an expression of who we are, our purpose is expressing ourselves as part of aliveness, right? Which means our purpose is actually our place in an ecosystem, really. So, sorry. Oh, that's all right. Oh, it's okay. Got visited by a little dog. So, yeah, let me kind of come back to center with that. Yeah, so Stephen Jenkinson talks about legacy. I've heard him talk about legacy before. And he talks about how, many people are very fixated in this idea of leaving a legacy. What's the legacy I'm leaving? What's the thing I'm doing, the accomplishment or the trophy or the statue or the memorial, right? Or the world-changing contribution, whatever it is, right? We think of that as our legacy. What's the thing I've done or will do that will be the thing that outlives me, be the thing that keeps my name alive? And so I think there's a lot of fear of death that's actually entangled with that, up with this idea, because there is at the heart of it this idea of we want to keep our name alive. I've heard it said before, it's like we die twice, right? Once when our physical body passes and our, ends and our soul passes on, and once when the last person mentions our name. And if we live, again, too, part of empire and part of this rupture from a more animist and what I often call ancestral way of living with things is this human supremacy, basically, right? This idea that, that humans are the center of the world. So there's a humility that I think we have to drop into to kind of come out of purpose anxiety and sort of this fear of death and this obsession with legacy. But one of the things that I've heard Stephen say that I really appreciated was, it's not what if we don't get to say what our legacy is, right? What if our legacy is actually determined by the people we leave behind and what they say about us? And so what if it's the same with purpose, right? What if our purpose, we don't actually get to say what our purpose is? What if our purpose is a combination of us? I love that Rilke quote, right? And it's shortened from his whole Letters to a Young Poet, I think is the name of the thing. And then I'll kind of be paraphrasing, but that idea of live the questions now, live them as if they were books you couldn't yet read, or languages you didn't yet speak, or doors you didn't yet have a key for, right? Live them now. What if that's the point, to live the questions fully so that someday we might stumble into living the answers? And so what if that's legacy? What if that's purpose, actually, right? We listen to how life and love are yearning to express themselves through us. And so again, for some of those single track people, maybe that's how life and love are seeking to express themselves through us. And for other people, maybe it's just loving their children. Maybe it's cooking good meals for their neighbors. Maybe it's doing their healing work. Maybe it's writing for fanfic that nobody other than other fans, will read. And yet, or maybe it's writing stuff nobody will ever read, but the act of the expression of it is part of the purpose. And then maybe we do share it. And that's also part of the purpose because it offers something to somebody else. But it's not something we can force or forge or will or create, right? Those are those sort of toxic manifestation, toxic masculine, control freak, honestly, kind of impulses. This idea that we can somehow make something happen separate from life living through us, separate from our relationships, separate from our challenges, separate from the whole, every piece of our journey, right? So let me pause for a moment here. Yeah. So, okay. So what does this mean then in terms of purpose anxiety, burnout, and then for this listener, integration? So, well, let me come back for a second. I've kind of touched briefly on this whole like capitalism and, creating these offers and products that then sort of prey upon this dysregulation and our own fragmentation, right? And then it's like we're grasping after things and we lack the discernment that we need because we're not even sure what the hunger is that we're trying to fill. We're not connected to our bodies or some deeper sense of discernment, which leaves us falling prey to a lot of these sort of big flashy promises. So this is where I think this listener was kind of drawing a parallel with, and asking like, so is integration then kind of one of the key salves to purpose anxiety? And I think a lot of what the skills necessary to practice integration, the cultural understanding to practice integration, I think that is. So in that sense, I think integration can serve as a sort of repair in the wake of this rupture, fragmented self. But I think the real true salve is actually relationship, and so one of the ways we can start to, as we're trying to kind of look for what our next healing modality might be or what our next kind of thing might be to help us tend to our fragmentation and move on our journey of like expressing aliveness through ourselves. One of the pieces that I think we can start to use to discern which offerings or which guides and facilitators we, want to work with is, is this offering me, like, am I drawn to the idea of the solution, right? Does this offering treat me as a resource to be, or this service or this product treat me as a resource? Like, am I being used as a resource to be extracted from for the benefit of whoever's offering this, or are they inviting actual relationship? And the thing is, we might get this wrong, our discernment, right? Because we often think we know what we know until we know better, And so unfortunately, quote unquote, getting it wrong is part of the journey, which means that it's not actually wrong. But yeah, this is like a whole other web of things. So I'm kind of trying to rein it in a little bit. Like I said, maybe this will even become more than just 2-part episode, because I feel like there's a lot that could be said on this subject, and I want to keep it semi-contained. Yeah, so I think actually I'm noticing my brain's starting to get foggy, which is sometimes like a sense that we're kind of coming to the end of what feels like enoughness for this moment, for this day. So I'm actually going to go ahead and kind of wrap it here and now. And I'll come back and I'll kind of record some more thoughts on this, because like I said, I think there's a lot to say here around this idea of purpose, and then particularly kind of now moving the conversation more into where I see it kind of showing up in sort of these capitalist systems, like how I see the current wellness world trends kind of feeding into purpose anxiety. the lack of integration within that world as contributing to burnout and purpose anxiety, and then what integration and a search for meaning and purpose that doesn't include burnout, that has a more animist and ancestral perspective, like what that might look like. And I think I'll say really briefly on that right now, just to kind of land us a little bit, is, I think when I look at a lot of these sort of what I'm calling ancestral practices, right? These ancestral perceptions, these ways of ancestors our ancestors may have had of creating culture. I see the skills that it helped them build, the practices that were there. I see all of that as a way of holding us in some sort of ongoing practice and expression of life through us, right? Holding us in some sort of living beautifully and living meaningfully, right? That a meaningful existence was woven more all through culture and all through everything that they did. So I think that in many ways is the salve, actually, for burnout and then also purpose anxiety. And so I'll go more into that in more detail some other time, but I just kind of wanted to wrap with that. So I'll leave you, with this idea of, again, like relationship, not resource. And purpose being relational and an expression of aliveness through us rather than a thing that we do, And some people might say, what if purpose is just presence? And, to that I'd say, I think we are still meant to actually do some things, like we're meant to take action. And that's part of why I like the idea of it being an expression, because sometimes that expression is quiet and simple and present. And sometimes that expression is active and creative and more out in the world, and proactive and co-creative, right? So that's part of why I think I like that idea of expression. So anyway, what do you think? And I want to say, like, I love that this listener took a moment to send me this email, because now it's prompted a whole bunch more podcast episodes that, I think are hopefully something that she'd find helpful and or thought-provoking, and and I'm sure there are others out there grappling with the same thing. So if you hear things here that have you wondering or that have you thinking, please, by all means, like, let me know. It's gratifying, right, to know that I'm not just like talking to myself into the void, that there are people, like other humans, on the other end of this, right? This is part of that relational piece. This is like, I'm creating something, I'm putting it out there. Yeah, there's a value in just expressing and articulating for myself, but it really starts to come to life and become something else when you all engage with it, And in a written world, we've gotten used to just putting some sort of creative expression out there, and then people go off and engage with it, and then there's no conversation, there's no dialogue, there's no furthering. In oral traditions and oral cultures, you'd put something out there and then someone would come back with something, and then the first person would respond again, and then there'd be this back and forth, and that the understanding is that's actually how you create knowledge, that's actually how you create wisdom, is putting an idea out there, having someone respond to it. Well, this makes me think of this, and I'm drawing these connections, and what do you think about that, right? It's a way of testing, like, does what I'm saying stand up in someone else's experience? Does it hold up? Or is it just how I see the world because of my unique expression, but it's, it needs some other perspectives to fortify it, to strengthen it, right? So, when you write back to me, when you reach out to me, when you share these episodes with somebody else or enter into conversation around these subjects with other people, based on it, like, we are engaging with a form of knowledge making, a form of wisdom making. And that sounds pretty purposeful to me. So yeah. So I do. I welcome hearing. I don't necessarily have, all the time and energy to respond individually to everybody, which is part of why then I respond maybe through podcast episode or something like that. But I do welcome. And if you want to have more of that back and forth between us, like in real time, so that I can be responding a little bit more to you personally, and then maybe you get some to respond back a little bit, then that's what, like, my Wisdom Wednesdays, the first Wednesday of every month, it's pay what you can, including zero. If zero is what you can, then that's okay. And so that's the first Wednesday of every month. And that's a time and a space for these types of conversations. And so I'd welcome you there too if you want to kind of engage more. So, okay, that's enough rambling for me today. But I am sending much love, and I will see you next time.